Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Skype sessions. Today, I have a former guest of the show returning, Mr. James Como. James, how's it going?
It's going very well, David. Thank you. Here in New York, things are looking up. Fine.
Well, I saw on a forum that you have a new book coming out. So I immediately shot you an email and said, let's talk about that.
And I appreciate that. Indeed, I do have a new book and it is out. And this is the book. This is the cover. Everybody knows here that Perelandra is Venus.
Mm-hmm.
And there it is in the night sky. There's Venus in the night sky. And a person scaling the ladder of perfection in order to reach Venus. Very famous spiritual guy, the ladder of perfection.
Mm-hmm.
So it's been out for a while, and I'm very happy with it. I'm very happy with it.
So why write a book about Perelandra?
Well,
Were you just COVID bored?
no, I've been COVID bored, but that's not why I wrote this book. A few planets lined up. There seems to be a subgenre of literary criticism, which I'm calling recovery criticism. Mm-hmm. It's written by people who were beguiled by C.S. Lewis, but who now know better. And so they're writing books about how Lewis is wonderful, and he's so wonderful that they took them in, you see, but now they're over it.
And they've seen through it. I do believe Lewis said something about if you see through everything, it's the same thing as being blind.
They've seen through Lewis now that they're mature, now that they're grown-ups. And I just got frustrated with this. So somebody should write an answer to this. Been reading Lewis my whole life. He beguiled me. And I'm not over it. I'm still beguiled by C.S. Lewis. So that was one reason to do it, to address that subgenre. The other is my relationship with Perelandra, which is just, I read it first when I was about 20 years old. I wrote a master's thesis on it. And it stayed with me for the many times that I've read it, again and again and again. And then this is a process. It's not an event. It's not an epiphany, you understand? I started to look into my reasons for sticking with Perelandra, or Perelandra sticking with me. And I read a really important book, a really fine book by David Downing, who is the co-director of the Wade Center, called Into the Region of Awe.
Oh, that's a really good book.
Where he talks about Lewis as a mystic. And that was an epiphany. And the light went on. And I said, not only is C.S. Lewis a mystic, reticent, reluctant, but this book is an expression of that mysticism at its height. In fact, I think that Perelandra is the pinnacle, the absolute pinnacle of Lewis's apologetic project. Although he didn't see it as apologetics, of course, it's a vision that he had. So I decided that Lewis, I didn't decide, I saw that Lewis, as a mystic, was wrought by God the Father, dispatched to us by God the Holy Ghost, and was given voice by the Logos itself, God the Son. And among his many works is this peak of vision, which is Perelandra. So I had to write about it in those terms. And then I saw, thanks to my friend Dennis Beats, who is prominent in the Memphis C.S. Lewis Society, that this was a real study, a cartography, a map of spiritual theology, the formation of a soul. Because that's ransom. Now I have to say, I say this in the book, I've been reading all kinds of fiction for a very long time. One of my very first heroes was Tarzan. By the time I was about 12, I think I read all of the Tarzan books. And then
Tarzan, you Jim?
Yeah, something like that. But he very appealing for you because he doesn't know he's a hero, you see. And then later on, Odysseus became a real favorite of mine. Kind of the opposite. Odysseus knows he's a hero, But right there with him, and he's never spoken about this way, is Elvin Ransom. I mean, you couldn't have a more heroic figure than Ransom, because he's so ill-equipped for the role, he thinks, and so reluctant to be a hero. Let this cup pass from my lips, that sort of thing. And yet he does what needs to be done. And he knows that if he doesn't do it, it won't get done. It's just, there's no plan B, you know?
Mm.
So, not celebrated as one of the great heroes in English literature, nevertheless, he should be. And I wanted to set that record straight, because he undergoes this spiritual journey, spiritual theology, where his soul is tested and developed as the book goes on, through great strife, which is very important to spiritual theology, finally to the illuminative way, which is awe, and then it seems to the unitive way, because as we know, he comes back in that hideous strength and is a very different figure, a very different figure.
Now you're referring to a couple of technical terms, and depending on people's Christian traditions, they might not have heard of the purgative, the illuminative, and the unitive
Right.
way. Would you mind just unpacking that a little bit?
A little bit. It's there in the book. I do unpack it in the book, in the literature, especially from Saint Bonaventure and others. The three-stage process of achieving the unitive way. First is the purgative way, which is just what it says it is. You're purged. And then the illuminative way, where you get to the end of that, and because you're cleansed, you can see what you couldn't have seen before, and that's what you want. And then the unitive way is joining with that. And the hallmark of this is hope. I think everything, all the Christian work that Lewis wrote, and some of the non-Christian, is really about hope. It gives us hope. I don't think Lewis ever argued, maybe in Miracles, for a specific doctrine, a specific dogma. What he did is clear away the underbrush that keeps us from believing it, and then shows how it might have been. And of course, that's the case with myth. This might have been historical fact, you see. And so we get to the unitive way finally. So Ransom, with a wonderful, wonderful image. I mean, what could be more perfect than a man struggling in the dark in a cave to rise up out of the cave? I mean, whom does that not describe on earth? We're all in some dark cave, and we're trying to climb our way out, and very often it's dark, and we hear monsters behind us. And as was the case with Ransom, he hears this monster, and then he sees it is monstrous, but it's not a monster. It's just an innocent, huge beetle going about its own business, probably wondering what this guy is doing in my cave. But then he's pursued by a real monster, right? We know that because the unman has climbed and climbed and climbed. And he thought he destroyed the unman, but he didn't. So this satanic figure is always looking to grab a hold of us. And it's not until we do our due diligence and pay our dues that we get to the top, and Ransom does. And so he's out there, nurtured by the planet, fed by the planet, nursed, he says, by the planet. So he goes from purgation to illumination to unity, and has this magnificent vision. Now, I've read my Dante, I've taught Dante, and I do believe that this vision at the end, the great dance, I'm referring to the vision of the great dance, is the equal of Dante. There, I've said it. It's the equal of whom I love. I just, but especially the idea of the center. This was a Bonaventure idea, the ubiquitous center. Everything is the center. And he goes so far as to say that particle of dust is the center. And everything is part of the plan. And you're part of the plan, see? And it's ravishing. And what he sees and what he goes through, it's just ravishing. And then, of course, he sees the two Aldila, Perelandra, who is the Oyarsa of Perelandra, and Malacandra, who is the Oyarsa of Mars, Malacandra. and is finally sent on his way. And he is blessed, and he will be spoken of for generations. And another great gift of Lewis is perspective. He always brings perspective, like during the war, things still matter. Things still matter. We're being bombed, but they still matter. And you think culture is important? Well, I got to tell you something. Culture isn't that important in the New Testament. um, and so finally the king says, when this happens and this happens and this happens and this happens, spirals out now, there will be the beginning. So you think you've gone through a whole bunch of stuff and you finally come to the end of the journey. You haven't even started yet.
It's like the final chapter of the last battle.
Yes.
Just been a title on the cover page.
Yep. So it was literally, the word is so overused because it's used inappropriately, but in this case, it was awesome. It awed me. So that's another reason for having to write this book. Strife, awe, and finally hope, which is Lewis is great at. And I don't think any writing at all by Lewis exceeds what he achieves at the end of Perelandra. Now, I also happen to think that for me, this book is kind of a coda. I've written a lot about Lewis for over 50 years, spoken a lot about Lewis for 50 years, helped found the New York C.S. Lewis Society. There are people who think, this is an obsession of mine. They don't understand.
It's far more serious than that.
Well put. It's like when somebody says, "What's your favorite book?" My favorite book has always been Till We Have Faces, because it never occurs to me to name Perelandra is not a favorite book. It's a favorite apostolic vision. How many people, when they're asked for their favorite book, how many Christians would say, "Oh, well, the Gospels"? You wouldn't say the Gospels. Just like Lewis is not my favorite author because he's so much more than an author. But having written so much about him, and having talked about him so much, having done this and that, it seemed to me that this book would represent, as I said, a coda, a kind of recapitulation of a life looking along C.S. Lewis. So I revisit certain themes that I've addressed in the past about Lewis and his work, his rhetoric, for example, which was always of great interest to me. That's my professional interest. And friends and the like. Dark times in his life, for example, at the end of the 40s and early 50s, he goes through his own sort of purgation. His purgation, which was lifelong, owing to Mrs. Moore and to his brother's alcoholism, comes to a head. And he's writing to the Italian priest, now Saint Giovanni Calabria. And he says he's bone dry. He doesn't think he'll write anything anymore. But that's okay, because all of the accolades his writing brought him were a temptation to pride. And if the price of overcoming that was to never write another word, then he'd pay it very easily. He's bereft. I talk about the death of Mrs. Moore and how this was a release for Lewis. So I touch some bases along the way that I've touched in the past, and I bring it in chapters 4 and 5. Chapters 5 and 6, because the book has the structure is an ascent, right? And it's also personal because it's autobiographical in many ways. And without being too confessional, I don't think I'm too confessional. I do make mention of some strife in my own life, and there were many things that were releases for me on a mundane level. Baseball was always a real comfort to me, But among the more important things in this space-time continuum were my wife, Alexandra, and C.S. Lewis. And so this is a tale in many ways, and it's a very short book, as you know. It's almost as short as the Oxford VSI book, very short introduction book, that shows, in contrast to those who get over Lewis, who were bamboozled by him but now see through him, how in fact he sustained one reader. And at the very end of the book, I recount an anecdote which really makes the point. Do you mind if I recount that for you?
Go for it.
I was on sabbatical in 1974 in Oxford, preparing my dissertation, which was on Lewis, not Perelandra, but Lewis's rhetoric. And my wife was with me and my very young son. And Walter Hooper, God bless him, bless his soul, very, very dear friend, lifelong friend, arranged a room for us. He midwifed a rental of a room. So we were there, and we invited him, and his mother was visiting with his mother's sister, Aunt Twiggy, ironically named Aunt Twiggy. And we were at dinner when the phone rang. Now, as I say in the book, my mother died when I was 8. And I've examined the literature of early parental loss at some length for Branches to Heaven, the previous book that I wrote. And it's a bomb that will go off. Now, the bomb is different. My brother's bomb was very different from mine. And my fuse was much longer than my brother's. But there it was. Now, one of the results of this is I became very, very close to my father, very close to my father, who in his own way was a heroic man, raising a single father, raising 2 sons, one of whom is going nuts. My older brother just was devastated by mother's loss. And the phone rang and I answered it, and my brother saying that my father had died of a heart attack. The bottom falls out of things. They all looked at me and they could see something had happened. Now, at this time, in my preparation, in my research, I was working on A Grief Observed. David, there are no accidents. There are no coincidences. Now, I happen to think that parts of A Grief Observed is a contrivance. And if you read a collection of sonnets called 5 Sonnets, which Lewis had written about 10 years earlier, you can see the similarity in the subject matter between those 5 sonnets and The Grief Observed. It wasn't all impromptu journal keeping pouring out, right? Because the climax comes right in the middle of the book, and Lewis is too much of a literary artist to let that not happen. Anyway, so I'm writing it's a contrivance, you see, and the phone call comes, and I'm devastated, and I leave my family to go back to New York to bury my father, secure in the knowledge that Walter and his mother and aunt would look after my family. And I come back and I try to pick up where I left off. And I realize that A Grief Observed is now a completely different book. Completely different. Boy, did Lewis get it, contrivance or not. There's not an emotional false note. There's not a psychological false note in this book. He got it just right. And my point at the end of my book is that's the power of C.S. Lewis. 1 and 1 and 1 times how many millions of hearts and minds and souls affected by this man? Not movies made, not sales, not secondary literature written about him, but the penetration into the heart and soul of the individual reader is what makes him the great man he was. So that's, I hope some people who recovered from Lewis will read my book and read the end and know. Now, it's not only Narnia, you see, that's my point, because I do cover more than Perelandra. I do, in the first 2 chapters, walk through some other parts of Lewis. And I talk about Lewis as a fugitive, escaping, always escaping, as he was in Dimer, looking for a little end room, that little end room. And finally, at the end of Perelandra, you get something like a little end room, only it's bigger on the inside than the outside, much bigger and more glorious. So that's really the story, except for one more thing. That was my coda. I also see Perelandra as a kind of mini summa of Lewis's work. And I'll say this, I'll be ready to go behind the gym at 3 o'clock and fight anybody who disagrees, we'll settle like grown-ups. To really, really know C.S. Lewis, to really know C.S. Lewis. Now, I respect all of the scholarship done about Lewis. I've done a lot of it myself, and a lot of it is coming out now. And I do want to know when Lewis's conversion occurred exactly, this date rather than that date. It's not cosmically important, but it's interesting, But to really know C.S. Lewis, you must know Perelandra. Because there we have Lewis's soul, there we have Lewis's spiritual struggle, there we have Lewis's rhetorical and literary mastery, there we have Lewis's cosmological knowledge as a medieval scholar. It's all packed in there. There we have his literary breadth, because there is Dante in Perelandra. All of Lewis is packed into this book, including Lewis. As you know, he names himself as a kind of narrator of the book, but always protecting himself, you see. There are layers between him and us. It's Lewis the author, then Lewis the implied author, who's the character telling the story. Or is he? Because there's Ransom telling Lewis the story, so Lewis can tell us the story. So Lewis insulates himself. And I think, and I point this out in the book, John Lawler wrote a wonderful book about C.S. Lewis, a very brief book, Memories of C.S. Lewis, Memories and Reflections. And he reproduces in his book a page of Lewis's copy of a medieval spiritual text. And in so doing, he shares Lewis's annotations, because as we know, Lewis would often write more on a page than was printed on the page. one of those guys. And Lewis says, here is a height of sainthood, which I would never presume to claim for myself, but only seek to strive for. It's a depth of spiritual insight which is daunting. I'm paraphrasing. I'm not quoting verbatim. That I wouldn't presume to reach for. And it's indicative. And elsewhere in letters there is the same kind of modesty, the same kind of reluctance to claim things. But then we know something. We know that when Lewis was dying, he woke up, and Walter Hooper tells the story. He stared into the distance. Now he's in a room, of course, but he seems to be staring into a great distance. And he said, according to Walter, oh, I never knew. I never knew. And someday, if I make it up there to meet Lewis, I'm going to say, you really did know. you just wouldn't admit it. So, okay, you had to put it in a novel, but we all really get it, Jack. You knew all along. So that's part of the point. Lewis was a mystic, reluctant mystic, would not have admitted to it. He achieved it in his greatest vision, Perelandra. For me, it was a lifelong and in many ways very intimate relationship with Lewis and what he did to me and is still doing. I mean, works in progress, all that kind of stuff, And hoping for a little end room one day.
That's a perfect way to end. I think you've given us a real flavor of what you're exploring in this book. And I hope people go out and get it. Where can people purchase it?
Well, it's on Amazon now. By the way, it's in both hard and soft cover. the publisher decided to do something he had never done before, which is to bring it out in both at the same time. And it's also as an ebook, and I downloaded the ebook myself just to have it, on my Kindle handy. But the ebook is a replica of the printed book. So you're not going to get the kind of ebook you would ordinarily get, right? You're going to get pages and pages of the actual book, which is, I don't, you may or may not mind that. But in the meantime, it's available in paperback and hardcover.
Okay. Well, there'll be links to all of that in the show notes. James Como, thank you for coming on the show.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me, David. And it's lovely to speak with you.
You too. You too.
Bye-bye.
And everyone, please join us again next time when we'll go further up and further in. Cheers.
Cheers.